Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome back to Access to Democracy. Alan Miller returning, hosting, and we have a return guest, a very exciting gentleman who's been here a half dozen times, perhaps in the past, Dave Feinwachs, who's an attorney, but frankly, he has more degrees than a thermometer. So that's just one of his many talents. And Dave has been here before. He's the whistleblower who blew the lid off of the fraud that's going on in our healthcare system. And unfortunately, the U.S. Attorney opted out a few months ago of pursuing it through his office. I can't understand why, but things are happening, including in today's paper, an audit which found errors in our Medicaid payments, in which the state owes over $3 million, has to pay back to the federal government. Well, the errors that you found initially resulted in what, $107 million payback?
Initially, the work we did in 2012 resulted in $107 million returned to the federal government by our 4 HMOs. And interestingly enough, the audit that you mentioned covers that time period. But I guess it doesn't mention that because that was money that was given back, where these are the crumbs that are left over.
And this is money that was still under the carpet, which has just been swept out.
This is money that they were able to find, but the $107 million was nothing. That was the tip of an enormous iceberg, and this is so infinitesimally small, it doesn't even begin to get at what's really at issue here.
You've been at this for how many years, Dave? I mean,
you
were part of the healthcare system at one point. You were an attorney.
I was an attorney. I was general counsel for the State Hospital Association. I was terminated from that position in 2010. And in 2000...
Because you blew the whistle.
Yes.
You asked questions.
Yes. I was told to leave this alone, not to investigate it. It had been discovered that I had actually hired an attorney to look into it. And they wanted this kind of investigation stopped, and I felt that it was essential that this investigation go forward, because if something isn't done, Social Security itself will be imperiled, the entire healthcare system will be imperiled. It is simply too big a problem to ignore.
Now, the fact of the matter is that we keep uncovering more and more. I guess fraud is probably a minor term here. It may be even criminal that we're talking about. And let's talk about the 4 providers by name in Minnesota.
The big 4 companies in Minnesota are Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, Health Partners, UCare, and Medica. Those are our big 4 not-for-profit HMOs, or so-called not-for-profit HMOs, and they basically dominate the market in this state. And they operate largely in a cartel-like fashion. And they control most of what goes on. Most of what they do is a secret. They have always claimed that their information, what they actually pay, what they do with the money, how much things cost, is in fact a trade secret. And the notion that what vendors to the government do with entirely taxpayer, tax-funded money is some kind of secret is mind-boggling.
But That's not a proprietary secret. That's not as though it's the composition of a drug or something like that.
Absolutely.
This is money that taxpayers are paying, one, into the federal government, that the federal government is paying back to the state, and or if there's collusion and fraud and criminal conduct, which is plain stealing, we have a right to know about it.
If you look at it in its simplest terms, what it boils down to is this. This year, we give these people $5.3 billion with a B dollars. When I began looking at this in 2010, we were giving them $3 billion. The amount of money that is poured into this program has gone up 66%. There are no increased payments to providers. Nobody knows where the money goes. The controversy is around a simple question. What did you do with the money that was given to you? Did you spend any on health care? How much did you spend on health care? What did you do with the rest? And how much did you keep for yourself? Apparently, the answers to these questions are considered by these companies to be on the same level as the source code for Microsoft Windows or the formula of the drug which will eventually cure cancer, God willing. Most people don't see it as that kind of a secret.
I would not think it is either. I mean, it's our money, in effect, the people's money, whether it's federal or state. Now, these are the same companies that resisted the Affordable Care Act. These are the same companies that have just said that they're going to increase fees, premiums, by an average of 73%.
As much as 73, 74%. What's going on now in the marketplace in Minnesota was never supposed to happen under the Affordable Care Act. In fact, the Affordable Care Act was supposed to prevent it. These people who are experiencing these increases are the former people who were in the Minnesota Comprehensive Health Insurance Exchange, or what we used to call MCHA. These people have now been sort of gathered together in a single boat and cut loose and said, well, you're too expensive based on our experience. But the idea of the Affordable Care Act was all the risk was to be pooled, and everybody was supposed to be together to flatten out both the risk and the premium, but that's not happening. What happened was most people have been put into Medicaid, which is paid for by the federal government, or Minnesota Care, which up until now has been largely paid for by the federal government, or they have coverage through ERISA employers, and the poor unfortunate leftovers, they're now being cut adrift saying you're going to experience increases of up to 74%. What's fascinating here and what should enrage them and should enrage us is, if the state wanted to prevent this, it could. The state could say to these plans, we're going to use our leverage contracting ability. You do business with us. You run our state employee health plan. You participate in workers' compensation. You participate in Medicaid, in Minnesota Care, in all these programs, and you make all your money on these programs. We're going to insist that leverage be used to lower the premiums of these unfortunate people. That would be the logical, the easy, and the appropriate thing to do. But that's not happening.
Although the governor reacted rather vehemently when they made this announcement of the increase.
The governor reacted appropriately and in a timely fashion. He said the increases were, and I'm quoting him, outrageous, and they are outrageous. He also said that in his mind, health care hadn't increased recently, perhaps 3% at the most, and he's absolutely right. What's interesting is our health plans, these HMOs, we've been telling the federal government that health care has been experiencing inflationary increases of up to 11, 12% every year for the past 15 years. Where'd the money go? Because the federal government has been paying us as if that was true. And of course, it's not true. And so it raises the question, what happened to all this excess funding? Why was this money obtained under these pretenses? And how do we account for it now? And is this the future of the Affordable Care Act? We're simply going to price gouge and victimize anybody that we can't put on the Medicaid program where we can bill the federal government for them.
And it's interesting because I'm thinking of a case when my own mother was alive, and over and above what was paid for by the insurance, she got a very substantial bill for, I don't know, several thousands of dollars, including drugs that she never got. I demanded an itemization of the bill. I went in and I said, I'm prepared to fight this. I want to know where these things are going, what the costs are. And they just dropped it right there.
And what you have discovered is the best kept secret in healthcare. If you have a problem with a healthcare bill, the smartest thing you can do is to say, explain this. What I tell people to do is, you explain this to me, because if I don't pay it and you take me to court, I'm going to insist you explain it to a judge. And if you can't explain it to me, that means you can't explain it to a judge. And 9 times out of 10, those bills will be dropped, because those bills are, in fact, inexplicable. Let me tell you why they're inexplicable. What's happened in the last year or so has been fascinating. There's a case that developed and was finally ultimately adjudicated in Michigan involving Blue Cross of Michigan. It's called Hylex Controls versus Blue Cross of Michigan. And in this case, a little company with 800 employees, Hylex Controls, they make car parts, they had an employee benefit plan that provided health insurance, and they used Blue Cross to process their claims. They paid Blue Cross money, they had a contract. Blue Cross paid the providers at the rate that they had contracted with the providers, which then was the rate that Hylex was to pay. The employees got access to the Blue Cross network, and Blue Cross acted to process the claims as the third-party administrators, and they were paid a fee for this. This went on for 20 years, and this is the standard kind of arrangement across the country. The employer found out through a leaked memo that what had been going on all these years is when their employees received health care, say for example hospital care, if Blue Cross actually paid the hospital $5,000, Blue Cross reported to the employer a much higher amount. The employer paid Blue Cross the higher amount out of the employee benefit fund because, after all, what Blue Cross actually pays is a trade secret, as we just discussed. And what they did with the difference was simple. They put it in their pocket. The employer was outraged and sued. The employer won. What's fascinating about this case is during the litigation, Blue Cross actually argued, everybody does this. All HMOs do this. This is how they make their money. This inflation of charges, this is what we do. This is the nature of the business. There was even expert witnesses that asserted this.
This is why Europe laughs at us, because our healthcare system is so fouled up. It's so opposite of what they do over there and handle very well. I'm picking on Europe. You could pick on several locations where they have single payer, which we don't have. Now, I think oxymoron is an appropriate word for describing these nonprofits, because they are not nonprofits. There are people getting tremendous salaries. There are people who are making $1 million a year working for these companies, presidents, vice presidents, etc. Their average, as I understand it, their average administrative costs are something like 25 to 28%, and yet Medicaid runs on what, 3%?
3 to 4%, and here's what's fascinating, and forgive me for correcting you, but the figures that you're talking about are, in my estimation, chump change. These companies are not for profit, and the salaries, first of all, that they pay their executives are far greater than $1 million or $2 million a year, but that's really not the issue. That's, in the overall scheme of this thing, that's chump change. These companies are exempt from taxation. They don't pay property taxes. They don't provide charity. They don't give back to the community. They price gouge, they victimize, and best of all, it's all a secret. And they argue, and they've argued just this year, if we told you what we spend, we would have to increase our costs. Our price would go up. If you knew what we did with the money, our price would go up. Now that argument is so illogical and so crazy that it makes most rational people laugh. Why would the price go up if I knew what you did with the money? What would happen if I knew what you did with the money is I would eliminate you and find a better way to administer it. As you suggest, if the government has an overhead of 3 to 4%, and by the way, based on what I now believe, these programs operate clearly at a margin of 40%. Okay? So almost half of every healthcare dollar disappears. It's completely wasted. And what's so dangerous here is this imperils the future of Social Security, this imperils the healthcare system, and people in this country should not have to engage in a debate where the answer is, I can't tell you, it's a secret.
Well, interestingly enough, in the Hylex case, which you mentioned, and unfortunately, the record is sealed in that case so that people don't have access to it. And I hope that you do, because I hope that you go forward with your lawsuit where the U.S. attorney, for reasons unbeknownst to me, decided not to prosecute in terms of criminal charges. But you still have the civil complaint and you can still go forward with it, and I hope you are. In the Hylex case, the judge said some pretty shocking things, and I think you have some of those quotes with us.
Yes, absolutely. In the Hylex case, the judge said that the hospital claims had been inflated with hidden surcharges in order to enrich Blue Cross. Regardless of the amount Blue Cross was required to pay, in this case a hospital, it reported a higher amount that was then paid by the self-insured client. The federal judge said in Hylex that the scheme made it appear to customers, like plaintiffs or the government, that the claims paid to providers were higher than they truly were. And that's what we do in Minnesota. We tell people our hospitals, our doctors are so highly paid, and that is the reason the health care is so expensive, and our health care system is so expensive, when in fact they're not very highly paid, and that's not the reason. The judge also said that this, in addition to making the providers seem to be more highly paid than they were, made it seem to customers that they were paying less administrative fees than they actually were. And of course, in Minnesota, we have told people for years that our cost of administration of these programs is only 10%. 10%. Although this past year, magically, the HMOs have argued it's dropped to 5%. You know, it's even better now. It's down to 5%. But of course, there's no audit, there's no data. The court went on to say that the reports that Blue Cross gave were false, and Blue Cross knew them to be false at the time they gave them. The court also said such things as, Blue Cross argued that they needed to do this because the state insurance commissioner required them to do it, and the court found no evidence that the insurance commissioner or the regulatory scheme for insurance required any of this. The court said that all of the certifications and reports here were misleading and intentionally misleading. The court said that no diligent person could have uncovered this because, remember, in the Hylex case, this came to light because of an accidentally leaked internal memo which sort of was yucking it up about how we're doing this. The court said that the most diligent and skilled chief financial officer in the world could not have uncovered this because all of the documents were falsified, everything was hidden, it was a carefully concealed fraud. This case was appealed in the federal court system to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the decision against Blue Cross was upheld. Blue Cross asked the United States Supreme Court to review it. The Supreme Court declined, and the decision stands. Now, the challenge is to perpetuate this elsewhere. And just so you know, one very large multinational company in Minnesota has already hired a very large law firm in Chicago to investigate whether Blue Cross of Minnesota is involved in the same kinds of activities. And so, hopefully, this kind of investigation and inquiry will continue.
Now, the judge actually used the words criminal conduct, did he not?
Well, the judge, and this was a civil case, the judge here referred to this as fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violating a number of the statutes having to do with ERISA, which is the management of self-insured and self-funded, employer benefit plans. But the court was as strident as a court could be in condemning this conduct, and amazingly enough, one of the Blue Cross arguments were, even if we did this, it's your fault. You should have uncovered this. You should have detected this years ago. It's too late for you to complain about it now.
Even though we kept everything secret.
Right, and the judge hammered them saying, that's crazy. No one could have uncovered this. The only reason it came to light is because of the accidental leakage of a memo.
And do we have any reason to think that things are any different in Minnesota?
No. In fact, part of the argument in the Blue Cross Michigan case was that this kind of conduct is universal. This is how they make their money. People who observe managed care knows that managed care doesn't manage care. Ask your own physician, ask a dentist, ask anybody who works in a hospital if managed care actually manages care. They deny claims, they leverage contracts, they sequence and delay treatment, and they do this. That is what managed care does. So we know now how it works. We know what the scheme is to inflate the apparent costs. And of course, if you're a healthcare provider, at this point you should be enraged because remember, doctors and hospitals and dentists, they're the ones who for years have been blamed as the cost drivers in healthcare.
And when we say they manage claims, they have people, generally not medical people, who are claims supervisors who can say yay or nay when somebody brings forward a claim.
This is an elaborate bookkeeping system. Okay, we live in a world with the internet and with data transference possible in nanoseconds. The kind of information that is managed in these programs is not difficult to deal with. We have the technology and we are capable of dealing with it. They manipulate it, they conceal it, and they use it to leverage to benefit their own ends, and that in fact is the cost driver in this system.
But you say a large corporation here is starting a Hylex type investigation.
Yes.
And you, of course, exposed a lot of this a decade ago, basically, and have been one voice that's really been fighting this system, albeit very successfully, except for the fact that, I will repeat again, that the U.S. Attorney decided not to go forward with it. Is there not somebody within the state who could do this and go and get involved in this?
There are a number of people in state government who can do this, but you have to understand, let me give you a sampling of the arguments being made on the other side. Let me tell you what the HMOs argue. Even if we're doing this, an enormous amount of Minnesota's infrastructure is dependent on the federal money that we are leveraging, that we are bringing in. And it would cause budget difficulties. So you as a legislator or a public official, you don't want to ask about this. You don't want to ask, you don't want to know. This is above your pay grade. You don't want to look into this. And to punctuate that perspective, in January, the person who used to run the trade association for the HMOs published a piece in the Star and Tribune newspaper in which she was angry about something in this particular situation that I had said, where I criticized the amount of reserves, as I have done for the many years, that these HMOs have. And in her article, she said, when you look at HMO financial statements, it's easy to miss that contrary to what the commentary claimed, that would be me, HMO reserves are not cash on hand. In fact, more than half of what appears on paper to be HMO reserves is actually money the state has yet to pay the HMOs. And then she goes on to say, there is an HMO shift to the state which totals more than $1.3 billion. Well, that's a troublesome statement, because HMO reserves do in fact have to be cash. The reason we tell the federal government we need money for reserves is to pay claims. So if the money is not needed to pay claims and we're in fact sitting on an IOU from the state in exchange for giving the state money which was designed to provide health care to citizens, that would be a problem. And HMO reserves can't just be on paper. They have to be real money. They have to exist. So this raises a series of very, very troublesome questions which need immediate examination. And this is related to the argument which is being made to legislators, you don't want to know. In fact, just this year, in 2012, way back when I was on your program with you, I told you that there was a law enacted in Minnesota that said in 2014 there would be an audit of these programs in Minnesota. And
Right.
we would get to the bottom of this.
Well, it's now 2015.
That audit never occurred. Our legislative auditor produced a memo to legislative leaders in 2014 saying that he was unable to find an independent auditor that was sufficiently independent to satisfy him. and therefore the audit wasn't done. But fear not, he was going to do the audit. He went back to the legislature in early 2015 this year and said, well, we looked at some stuff and, I really didn't do the audit, so I'm going to give you back the money that you appropriated for me to do the audit because you don't want to do the audit. It's hard. It would make your head hurt. You don't want to do this audit. Don't worry about it. And so there's no audit. There's never been an audit of these programs. Amazingly, in March of 2015, the United States Government Accountability Office issued a report that said, the problem with Medicaid is that there are no audits, and you need clearly to audit money in and money out of HMOs to see if any Medicaid program is functioning properly, effectively, and within the confines of the law. That was their recommendation. They make this recommendation at the same time we're telling our legislators, we being the legislative auditor in the HMOs, you don't want to audit this. You don't want to look at this. So that's what we're up against.
It boggles the mind.
It
really
boggles the
does.
mind. For the average person watching this program, for the average citizen thinking about this, here's what you have to keep in mind. That article in the newspaper about premiums going up 74%, today, that's about them. Tomorrow, it's about you. And if you're collecting Social Security after a lifetime of hard work, we've all heard that the Social Security system is imperiled, it's unsustainable. Well, allow me to assure you that this is going to drag it down in short order. So, we have to ask ourselves a series of questions. Are we willing to sacrifice the Social Security system, our health care system, our access to affordable care so that these so-called nonprofit corporations can continue to make money in the fashion that they make it and in the magnitude that they make it while everyone and everything else suffers? Is there really a point to this? Does this strike anybody as a logical mechanism? But for the amount of political influence and money that moves around in this system, I think that this system would have crumbled long ago, that people would have rioted in the streets. But as we know from talking about it, we're talking about a very complex scheme and a very complex system. It's a difficult story to tell, and that's why...
But it can be told.
It can be told.
Hopefully it will be told. It's something you've been trying to tell for a decade. And maybe with cases like Hylex and the local investigation, maybe we're seeing the first chink in the armor of protection that these companies surround themselves with their high-paid lobbyists, with their big law firms, with everything else. We're speaking here literally to Dave or David against the Goliath of the healthcare system, and we have run out of time, but we will continue this with Dave Feinwachs, who really is the people's champion. Dave, thank you so much.
Thank you.